Welcome to A Hiccup in Time with your host, Michael Dunhill.
Welcome to the first episode of Hiccup in Time. Of course, I'm your host, Michael Dunhill. The goal for this podcast is to feed the spiritually hungry, to give them and myself something that would help us to grow spiritually. This is a staple missing from a lot of our churches today. I personally believe there needs to be changes. You might be asking, what type of changes? Changes in behavior of our church leaders, changes in what's being taught. That's keeping us down spiritually. Actually, lessons that have been being taught for centuries. I can't speak for everybody. I'm tired of feeling like I have to be a servant to the church. Being told that I have to be at the door every time that door opens. I'm personally tired of giving money to support messages telling me that I'm obligated to give more money. Messages saying that I'm robbing God if I don't at least give 10% of my income. It makes me sad in my heart to watch my brothers and sisters suffer, seeing hungry people in the street, watching pastors living like kings and their wives living like queens. My prayer is that this podcast would create a link between you and I to where we can learn to grow spiritually together, and that our eyes will open. We'll learn by God's instruction what His will is for our life. Am I taking donations? Absolutely not. All I'm asking for is 20 or 30 minutes of your time. That's it, period. I'm not trying to make any money off of this podcast. With that being said, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce myself. So far, all you know about me is my name is Michael. I'm a licensed minister. I had a church for several years. I received my license in 1985. Preached in a lot of the churches here in the area. I had a church for several years, and I worked at a Christian TV station. I'm retired at the age of 67. I'm doing a podcast. I write Christian books and give them away for free. I was born in New York, not the city. Most people in the South, where I currently reside, think of the Big Apple when I say New York. The Statue of Liberty, the Twin Towers. I was born in Rochester, New York, where they actually have farm animals, pigs and chickens and cows. They also have these beautiful redwood trees, and it's actually country. I live in Monroe, Louisiana, Ouachita Parish. I dare you, try spelling that. When I first heard that word, it threw me. I'm not even going to go into it, but it's spelled Ouachita. It's terribly hard to say, and people that are from up north have the hardest time saying it. I can say it now. I've been in this area long enough. Ironically, I was born in Monroe County of Rochester, New York. At the age of 2, Dad had left my mother. He walked out on her. He left her in financial ruin. She had no money. He left her with no transportation whatsoever. She was like totally blindsided by this. On top of that, he brought me, my brother, and my sister along for the ride. My brother and sister are older than me, not by much. We're each 1 year apart. This happened back in the 50s. Since Dad took us children without my mother's consent, she went to the police. They just told her, be a good wife and go home, and don't worry about it, he'll be back. Our dad decided to move us all into, get this, a 1958 Chevy station wagon. There was my brother, my sister, my dad, and myself, and the family dog, Duke. Duke was not a small dog by all means. He was big. He took a lot of room up in this car. Could you imagine all of us living in this car? This 1958 station wagon. These cars were not really very small. It was pretty crowded, all of us being packed in there. Hearing this story the majority of my life, going by my dad's account, he said that he didn't have much money when he took off. You might be asking, how did we eat? Here's what my dad did. It's pretty interesting. Dad taught us kids how to get food for free. Not a very good lesson for a dad to be teaching. He said, when I bring a pastor to the car, disfigure your face. He showed us, he gave us an example. He said like this, and I want you to really look as sad as you can. I want you to put your hand over your stomach. I want you to groan like you haven't eaten in a long time. You know how you do when you're really hungry. When Dad would stop at a church, we kids would stay in the car, and sure enough, the pastor would come to the station wagon. He'd look into the window. Then we knew that this was our cue. We did exactly what our dad instructed. We always drove away with groceries in the car. I'm not really sure how long we lived in this car, but thank God we didn't live in the car forever. It was just only for a little time. Eventually, our dad placed each of us into separate temporary foster care homes. When he left, he promised that he would return. I was 4 years old when he did. I had forgotten that I had a brother and a sister. I barely remembered Dad. Dad finally did return. He picked me up first. He went and got my brother and my sister. Once we were all together, our dad announced we're headed to live in Alabama. When we made it to Alabama, our dad placed us all together in a Catholic church home. I remember a little bit being there. I also remember that the nuns were good to us. It really didn't seem long before our dad came back. He carried us to another home in Mobile, Alabama. It was a Protestant children's home. When he left us off, I remember he promised us that he would come back. We would eventually all be living together. Dad would come around every third weekend, pick us kids up. We had a blast with him. Dad was a very charismatic person. He knew how to make it fun. He made sure that we kids had a good time. He would take us swimming, camping, all sorts of things. When the time came for us to go back, my dad would always buy each of us candy. That made us love him, right? Placed it into this big brown grocery sack, and he gave each of us one. He always left us off with a promise. We are all going to live together soon. Followed his statement with a question. How do you children feel about this? And of course, we would jump up and down and clap our hands and holler. We were just ecstatic about this. I remember we were pretty sold on it. We kids were sad when he brought us back to the home. We were also still, like I said, excited about the fact that we would all eventually live together. We thought that our dad hung the moon. It couldn't wait until that day came. And then finally, it came. One weekend, our dad picked us up, and he made an announcement. He said, I'm coming back to pick you guys up this week, and we're going to all live together as a family. I was 7, my sister was 8, my brother was 9. Within the first week of us kids living with Dad, our dad's mask fell off pretty quickly. Truth was finally revealed. Our dad was an alcoholic, and he certainly was not a happy drunk. Whiskey was our dad's demon. My sister became my dad's target. He would find any reason he could when he got drunk to beat her. He would pull her hair, push her against walls, kick on her. Not only did he physically abuse her, he also verbally abused her. Now, mind you, she was only an 8-year-old, and he'd call her a whore. He'd tell her she was just like her mother, in which my sister barely remembered her mother. And this would happen near every night. I remember this like it was yesterday. I'd be sitting in the living room listening, actually wishing that I didn't even have ears. The more I heard, the less I could take. I thought, I can't just sit here with her getting hurt and listening to her cries, just ignore it. I was just a kid at the time, but this was running through my head. Just really couldn't take it anymore. I made up my mind I was going to rescue my sister. I had plans to stop her from crying every night in pain. The next night, it started again like always. This time, instead of just sitting there, I jumped up, ran into the kitchen where my dad was beating her. I jumped on my dad's back. I started beating him in his head. Now, you can imagine the 7-year-old trying to hurt a grown man. He grabbed me, he tossed me against the wall, and as he was kicking me, he was yelling. From that point on, it was either my sister or me. Dad would also verbally abuse me. He would say that I was ugly, stupid, no good for nothing, that I was a bum, that I would never amount to anything. Now you might be asking yourself, what was I thinking? To be honest, I thought that at the time, I could take them. In my mind, I'd seen myself putting them down and making him beg for mercy and forgiveness. I was kind of like a chihuahua. You know how they are? They come at you and you can just step on them. They're so little, but they're ferocious. They think in their minds they're big and strong. It was my syndrome. Instead, I found myself in a very bad situation that lasted a very long time. Actually, I have no regrets because I did give my sister a break. That was a good thing. And sometimes my dad was just content with beating me. My sister wasn't alone in the situation anymore. Our dad never beat my brother. Maybe it was just because he stayed out of it. I really don't know. When my sister and I became older, I was 9 and she was 10. We started running away. At this time, we lived in Fort Worth, Texas. We would make our way to Dallas, straight to the juvenile home. If you're watching the video to this podcast, I had found some pictures on the internet, and they're actually pictures of the detention home. The rooms in this home were not the greatest. The sink was attached to the toilet. Bed had a thin mattress on it. There was very little light that came into the room from the small window above the bed. The doors were very thick with a little window that you could look out of, and when that thing slammed, that was it. You were in there. This place wasn't the best place to be, but for my sister and I, it was paradise. Sometimes we would get a chance to stay there for a month. I understand that's a very odd statement. Being there, away from our dad, for a month was heaven on earth. There's a scripture in Revelations 12:11. It reads, "We overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony." I'm sharing these stories with you about my past, not to gain sympathy, but it's to give a testimony of where God brought me from. My hope is it'll bring encouragement to somebody that's suffering. The Lord's hand has been on my life, not only in a physical way, but also mentally. He kept me from losing my sanity. I've experienced a lot in my life. Some of these experiences was based on bad decisions I made. Some were just beyond my control. For instance, our dad carried us back up north, and he had brought us to live with his sister, our aunt. My aunt was a very wealthy lady. She lived in a nice, big, fancy house. She did not like children. She wouldn't allow us to be in the main parts of her house. And to solve this issue, she placed us in a room towards the back of the house. In this room, we could do whatever we wanted. We could draw on the walls. We made plenty of noise, I remember that. We could make all the noise that we wanted. None of it actually mattered. My aunt had hired a nanny to watch over us We hardly ever seen our aunt. I believe this is when I started associating money as being evil, causing people to be emotionally distant from one another. Dad eventually moved us all back to Texas from our aunt's house. When I turned the age of 15, I followed my brother into a bad situation, and that got me into a lot of trouble. I was locked up for near 2 years of my life. Right before I turned 17, I was released from this place I was locked up in. Dad had married a woman, and now I had stepbrothers and sisters. You would think now that I had a stepmother that things would be better. Dad was a drunk still. She was a drunk with him, so my abuse doubled. I got to the point where I couldn't handle it anymore. And in spite of the fact that I was on probation, I decided to run away. I was only 17. Where does a 17-year-old go when he doesn't have any money or any kind of assets whatsoever? I had nothing. I was completely, totally poor. I did the only thing I knew to do. I became homeless. It was then I learned what really being hungry was all about. Not having any food, not having any money, sleeping under bridges. One of the things that really hurt was people looked right through me as though I was invisible. I didn't exist. In every situation, every pot of boiling water that I experienced in my life, God was always there for me. He assured me that He loved me and He would speak to me. I could hear the comments already. Michael, go get your medication because you're hearing voices. Give me a chance to explain. When someone says they're hearing God, a lot of people tend to believe that they're speaking about an audible voice, like a voice out in the open air speaking down at you, because I think the media has taught us this, but that's not what I'm referring to. I'm talking about a voice in my heart. I knew God wanted me to do this and do that. I learned this lesson at a very young age. Dad would allow us kids to go to church, and there was a pastor. His name was Reverend White, and he started taking time up with us. I personally believe that he knew in his heart that we were being abused. And one of the main things and the most exciting thing he did with us was bring us to live football games. It was awesome to sit there and watch these players in real time. At one of these games, I remember tugging on the pastor's sleeve. Mind you, I was 8 years old at 8-year-olds are like that, annoying. And I grabbed the sleeve and I was tugging on it, and I said, Reverend White, I have a question. And he looked over at me and he said, what do you want, boy? And I knew he wasn't upset or mad because he was smiling. I asked him, do you hear God? With no hesitation, he said, yes, I do. I asked him, how? How do you hear God? He reached his hand over and he placed it on my chest. And he said, right here, right in your heart, you'll hear a still small voice. Now, as I had mentioned, I was 8 years old at the time, and I believed every word he said. And from that point on, I started hearing God. Now, don't get me wrong. I was not born again at the age of 8. That was not the case. There was a very traditional thought going about in the churches, being taught that if you hear God, you're saved, you're born again. That's not true. What it takes to be saved is surrendering your life to the Lord. It says in Scripture, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. I promise you I was not keeping His commandments. But I will tell you this, that me hearing God's voice was Him loving me. He was showing me how much He loved me, how much He cared about me. The main thing I was hearing from God was, Michael, when are you going to surrender your life to me? And my answer usually was, I'm not ready yet. I became ready at the age of 29. I finally gave in to his call by myself in our little room that I was renting in the area that I'm living now. I surrendered to him. I said, Lord, my life belongs to you, period. I have no regrets for that decision. Best thing I ever did. You might be curious about why I named the show A Hiccup in Time. I understand it's an odd name. It comes from an old saying a long time ago. When people experienced a hard time, after it was over, they would look back and go, well, that was just a hiccup. Life can be very difficult at times. I used to say this a lot when I was younger, and people misunderstood me, but I would tell them, but for God, it's just a drop in the bucket. The Lord is able to take care of our problems if we would just surrender our problems and place them into His hands and trust Him. Then we'd be able to look back and say, it was just a hiccup. That's all. It's in the past and I'm okay now. God carried me through. Praise His name. The vision for this podcast is we will allow ourselves to grow spiritually. One of the goals of Satan is to keep born-again believers babies, to keep them from partaking of any meat, something solid that God offers. He wants to keep us on milk. A lot of people have the philosophy of, I can do this on my own. I don't need any help. That's not true. The statement that says it takes a village, there's a whole lot of truth behind them words. I appreciate you listening in today, and I hope that you'll tune in again. If you have any comments you'd like to leave, feel free to contact me. My email address is mdnn40@gmail.com. If you're interested in an interview that will be played on this podcast, call 318-303-6359. I'm praying that God will bless each and every one of you. You've been listening to A Hiccup in Time with your host, Michael Dunhill.